Welcome back after a fantastic morning of talks, and we've got even more delights in store this afternoon. My name's June Barrow-Green, and I'm particularly delighted to be introducing the next two speakers because Ruth Boreham is going to be talking to us on Mary Somerville, the Polymath, Mathematics, Astronomy and Orange Marmalade. And Mary Somerville is somebody I have a particular interest in as well, so that's real excitement for me. So the stage is yours, Ruth.
Thank you very much indeed, and I must apologise, I'm not used to having such a large screen, and I had no idea how big my face would be when I sent through the PowerPoint presentation. So apologies for that. Not even my family have a picture of me that large. I also wanted to go for a title that had a bit of intrigue in it. I knew that I was doing the after lunch slot, which is always the tricky one to entice you back to, which is why there's the mention of orange marmalade in there. But I'm not going to tell you what that is just yet. I will tell you throughout my talk. I'm an independent researcher. I work full-time for a charity. I run women's history walking tours in Edinburgh. So my time to research and write on Mary Somerville is very limited. So it's fantastic to have the excuse to spend all day thinking about her and polymaths and all of the different connections. So thank you so much to Joe for inviting me to come and speak. But history has always been part of my life. My dad founded the Captain Cook Society, of which he is still editor the year that I was born. I don't know if that was in reaction to having a brand new baby or why he decided that year, but I have grown up with history as part of my life. In fact, my very first crush was on Joseph Banks. He'd been dead for some time, never mind. I'm not an academic, I'm not a scientist, but I'm fascinated in people. And so today I'm going to give you an overview of Mary's life, but in particular I want to tell you about my Mary. We all come to interests in Mary for different reasons, through mathematics, through science and the like, and I want to show you the Mary that really fascinates me. But first I want to tell you how I came to discover her. I love finding out how people got interested in their particular subject. Between 2005 and 2006, I was the John Murray Archive Project Curator for the National Library of Scotland. John Murray was a publishing firm established in 1768 and sold by the 7th John Murray in 2002 to Hodder Headline. It had stayed in the same family for the whole of that time, and when it was sold in 2002, it was the oldest independent publishing firm in the country. Annoyingly, every single generation had a John Murray. So trying to research which John Murray was involved in which could be a bit tricky. The publishing firm was sold to Hodder Headline, but the archive was still owned by the family and they were going to sell it. The archive had been valued at over £44 million, but the National Library was being offered it for a mere £33 million. We had checked down the back of sofas and we'd been able to find some money, but part of my job was to get to understand the archive better to help us with funding bids. I spent the best part of 9 months travelling back up and down, because I live in Edinburgh, down to London, to Albemarle Street in Piccadilly, London, this building that the second John Murray bought with the proceeds from selling Childe Harold by Byron. And once I was in a beautiful room, one where people like Byron and Scott and Livingston and Austen had once walked the carpets, I had the great pleasure of delving into the boxes to see what I could find. This photograph is not just to remind me of how young I once was, but it was also to show you the storage. This is Jenny Murray, the wife of the 7th John Murray, and she became the unofficial archivist at the time. The big names they knew about. It was the largest Byron collection in the world, although they did not sell us the hairs that Byron had been sent by in love women, and it wasn't head hair that they sold him. I'm quite glad actually we didn't get that, but we did. It was the largest Byron collection of archives. He'd published Walter Scott, so there was lots of papers to do with that. He was the publisher of Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species. He published David Livingstone, all of these incredible names they knew about. But as you can see behind myself and Jenny, there's lots of boxes, white boxes, and they were just labelled with the alphabet. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of letters in there. Most of them they didn't know anything about. So for 9 months, I got the fantastic job of just going through them all. And one day I decided to have a look at one of the boxes and I just said, S, let's see what's in there. So this big box came up and I opened the lid and I pulled out this letter. Neat, smallish handwriting, written from Florence, dated the 28th of March, 1857. It started, "Dear Mr. Murray, I was much pleased to hear from Mr. Pentland that the Council of Education has adopted my physical geography and that a new edition will be required immediately, but I must protest against it going to press till it is brought up to the present time. I've already completely recast the chapter on the ocean, but I much want information on Africa, an article that must be entirely rewritten. Perhaps you would have the goodness to send me Livingstone's book. The gold mines of California and Australia were not discovered when the last edition was printed, which will show you how far it is behind." There's a little more information on books wanted, swapping family news, and then the letter went on to say, "I have just heard news that surprised us not a little. Sir David Brewster, 76, and you'll see that she has underlined the age there, was married a few days ago to Miss Parnell, aged 26, a grocer's daughter. Sir David and his daughter have been living at Cairns, which he left a few days before the wedding without saying a word to his daughter of his engagement, but left her with the Duchess Dowager of Argyll, who had to tell her of it." Oh, I love this letter. It fascinated me. Here was a woman writing to John Murray as an equal, as a writer, during a period I often thought of as very dark for women in many ways. Clearly, she was published and well received. The fact that the Council of Education had adopted one of her books was proof of this. And yet I love that she also had this very human need for gossip. I could almost see her leaning on the garden fence going, "Psst, have you heard?" This was my very first introduction to Mary Somerville, and I've become slightly obsessed with her ever since. So very briefly, here are the kind of dates of her life, if you like. She was born in December on Christmas Eve in Jedburgh, the home of her maternal aunt. Her mother was coming back from a trip to London. Her father was a naval captain, William Fairfax, who would eventually become an admiral. The last time he'd been out to sea, he'd been captured and kept in a French prison for 2 years, and only an exchange of prisoners saw him returning to Scotland. So it's perhaps no surprise that his wife, Margaret, even though she was almost 9 months pregnant, wanted to spend as much time with him as possible, so went down to London to wave him goodbye. She was then making her way home to Burnt Island in Fife, which is just north of Edinburgh, when she got caught short and gave birth at her sister's house. In a twist to Mary's story, her mother was laid so low after the birth that Mary was suckled by her aunt, who would later become her mother-in-law. I'm not going to ask if that's happened to anyone here. But Burnt Island is where she grew up. It's a coastal town, and her father was largely away for many years. Her mother didn't really believe in education, just wanting to read the Bible, and Mary was allowed to run wild and free. She loved looking at the flora and fauna that she could see in her town. Occasionally, she was allowed to study with a village schoolmaster who taught her to use the terrestrial and the celestial globes and encouraged her to observe the visible night skies. But when her father returned from one of his voyages, he was disappointed to see she could hardly read or write and had no knowledge of language or numbers. So the family moved to Inveresk, just outside of Musselburgh, which is just outside of Edinburgh, so Mary could attend a fashionable and expensive school to learn to write well and keep accounts, which was all a woman was expected to know. She was there for 12 months, and she stated, "A few days after my arrival, although perfectly straight and well made, I was enclosed in stiff stays with a steel busk in front, while above my frock bands drew my shoulders back until the shoulder blades met. Then a steel rod with a semicircle which went under the chin was clasped to the steel busk on my stays. In this constrained state, I and most of the younger girls had to prepare our lessons." And whenever I read that, I always find I stand a little bit straighter, realising my shoulder blades are not back. This wonderful illustration by Lynette Gray has been lent to me by Ian Archibald, and I think illustrates that constrained state that she and her fellow pupils were in for 12 months. Miss Primrose's was expensive, and when Mary didn't do as well as hoped, she was brought back to Burnt Island after a year. She stated she finished her time at the school, like a wild animal escaped out of a cage. But she wasn't unintelligent, and this year had sparked an interest in her, and she took great pains to educate herself. During the winter months, Mary mixed with the upper levels of Edinburgh society, and it was an incredibly exciting time to be in Edinburgh. Men and women of the Enlightenment debating the serious matters of the day, and of course, lots of fun to be had. She took part in and delighted in the parties, balls, theatres and concerts. And she also undertook instruction in subjects deemed important for the development of young ladies, in order, of course, to attract a husband, for that is our only goal in life. And so I'm going to read this list out, and I hope all the females here have been receiving education to this matter. Cooking, writing, dancing, music, drawing and painting, but that's it. Nothing more. And all of these lessons worked. For in 1804, when she was 23, she married Captain Samuel Grieg, a cousin of her mother's. His father had been a Grand Admiral of Russia, serving Catherine the Great, and Samuel himself was also in the Russian Navy. The plan had been for his wife to move with him to Russia, but Mary's parents were reluctant for this, so instead he left active service and took up a position as a commissioner of the Russian Navy and Russian consul down in London. Mary moved to London as well, but found herself alone for most of the day. She was incredibly isolated, and her husband did not approve of her studies. She recalls, "He had a very low opinion of the capacity of my sex, and had neither knowledge of nor interest in science of any kind." She, of course, fulfilled her duty, and she gave birth to 2 sons. But within a few months of the birth of her second son, she had a bit of luck, although it might seem strange to call it that. A few months after the birth of William, her husband died. Samuel was only 29 and Mary 28, and normally I wouldn't celebrate the death of someone like this, but his death gave Mary an element of freedom as a widow, and she got a certain degree of independence through the inheritance he left her as well. She moved back to Edinburgh and resumed her studies. She was a widow for 5 years, then in 1812 she married for a second time, on this occasion with much more success. And these 2 portraits are actually at Somerville College, just down the road from here. William Somerville, on the right there, was also her cousin, and it was his mother that had suckled Mary as a child. So they were very close in many ways. He was an army doctor with a liberal outlook who was also interested in science, but he was very keen for Mary to continue her studies. He was an enormous support to her. He visited libraries on her behalf, many of which were not then open to women, copied and recopied her manuscripts, did proofreading, arranged meetings for scientific people for her as well. They spent the first 4 years of marriage in Edinburgh, and Mary continued her studies in mathematics, took up the study of Greek with her son's tutor, and together with William began to study mineralogy. In addition, of course, she also had more children, although they also suffered a lot from loss. Mary and William had a son who died within a year of his birth in 1814, the same year that Mary's second son from her first marriage died. William and Mary also had 3 daughters, one of whom died aged 10, and Mary described her as a child of intelligence far beyond her tender years, and also stated, "I felt her loss the more acutely because I feared I had strained her young mind too much." In January 1822, when they were then living in London, Mary and her husband attended a party at Beechwood Park in Hertfordshire. Among the people there was the novelist Maria Edgeworth, and I just want to read out her description of Mrs. Somerville, the famous learned Mrs. Somerville. Nothing learned or famous in her appearance. Little, slight maid, fair and fair hair with pinkish Scotch colour in her cheeks. If anyone knows what Scotch colour looks like, I would love to know, thank you. Eyes grey, small, round, intelligent, smiling eyes, very pleasing countenance. Remarkably soft voice, though speaking with a strong Scotch pronunciation, yet it is well-bred Scotch, not like the Baileys. She is timid, not disqualifyingly timid, but naturally modest with a degree of self-possession through it which prevents her appearing in the least awkward and gives her all of the advantage of her understanding at the same time. Mary became famous for small evening gatherings that they held at Hanover Square, parties which she described as very entertaining because she and her husband were intimately acquainted with every person of note, both scientific and literary and London. And as we heard from an earlier talk just before lunch, these gatherings could also take place outside in the garden with looking through telescopes and knocking on the door of their friends at 2 o'clock in the morning when they see that they're awake. Mary became the breadwinner of her household when William Somerville retired on ill health. To improve his well-being, and because it was a place that was much cheaper to live in, they moved to Italy, where Mary spent the last 40 years of her life. She continued to correspond with the leading scientific men of the day, and she also continued to work and publish. She died quietly in her sleep on the 29th of November 1872, and she left instructions that she was to be buried wherever she died. And she died in Naples, so that is where she is buried. This is not my photograph, though. As I was talking to Jean earlier on, I went in February 2020 to Naples to try and look at Mary. I wanted to go and say hello to her, basically, but the English cemetery is all locked up. And I couldn't get in at all. So there's probably a picture of me now making sure that I don't go back because I was rattling on the gate going, Mary, I'm here. I could only see her toe. That was all of the tomb that I could see. And when she died, obituaries called her Queen of Science for the books that she wrote. And this doodle is a Google doodle that was produced in February 2020. The Morning Post, announcing her death, said, "Whatever difficulty we might experience in the middle of the 19th century in choosing a king of science, there could be no question whatever as to the Queen of Science." So I want to look briefly at some of the things that she worked on, some of the things that lots of people know about, and one or two things that just absolutely fascinate me. And to do this, I'm just going to do it in an alphabetical order. So of course, we start with astronomy. In 1826, Mary, living down in London, was approached by the gentleman on the left about a publication he wanted her to undertake. Henry Broome was 2 years older than Mary, born in Edinburgh, trained as a lawyer, entered the House of Commons in 1810, fought against the slave trade, proposed educational reforms, and was also one of the founders of the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge in 1825. The object of that society was to publish information so that people who are unable to obtain formal education or preferred self-education could access the information. He wanted to bring out a condensed English version of Laplace's work, and he wanted Mary to produce it. She knew French, she was fluent in French, but she also had the mathematical training. Pierre-Simon Laplace on the right, born in 1749, was a French scholar, sometimes referred to as the French Newton. He was a mathematician, astronomer, and physicist who was best known for his investigations into the stability of the solar system. He had proved once and for all that the heavens were ruled by Newton's laws and that no divine intervention was necessary to keep the celestial orbs gliding along their paths. The version that Broome wanted to bring out required substantial introduction and explanation, and his request to Mary was a huge undertaking. She agreed, but only on the condition that if, when she had done her work, the manuscript was no good, it was to be thrown on the fire. It took Mary 3 years to complete the work. She recalls, "I rose early and made such arrangements with regard to my children and family affairs that I had time to write afterwards, not, however, without many interruptions. A man can always command his time under the plea of business. A woman has no such excuse. At Chelsea, I was always supposed to be at home, and as my friends and acquaintances came so much out of their way to see me, it would have been unkind and ungracious not to receive them. Nevertheless, I was sometimes annoyed. Within the midst of a difficult problem, someone would enter and say, 'I have come to spend a few hours with you.'" And I can't help reading that and thinking of Virginia Woolf and the desire for a room of one's own a few decades later. The amount of work Mary did was phenomenal. Translation does not do it justice. It required explanation, illustrations, charts, etc. Catherine Neely describes it as rendering, in other words, rendering it to make it clear. Once completed, Broome decided actually it was far too long a manuscript for his low-cost series, but on John Herschel's recommendation, the publisher John Murray accepted it. The Mechanism of the Heavens appeared in 1831 and was generally well received. In the following year, much more popular was the largely non-mathematical introduction, published separately as the preliminary dissertation to the Mechanism of the Heavens. It summarised the current state of astronomical knowledge for the general reader. It became a text recommended in advanced mathematics at Cambridge and would, for almost 100 years, also be used by those teaching higher mathematics and astronomy. Mary was 51 at this point, and as someone who has still not finished writing her biography yet, I feel I have time on my hands. While preparing the preface to the Mechanisms, Mary had been struck by the mutual dependence and connection in many branches of science. This she developed further as the theme for her second book, which was published in 1834 as On the Connection of the Physical Sciences. The second book was even more successful than the first and was John Murray's most successful science book until Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, so over 20 years later. It went into 10 editions by 1887, many of them updated by Mary herself. This book also helped to inspire others. For example, in the 6th edition, published in 1842, Mary wrote a prediction that another planet was out there, ready to be discovered. Uranus was the most recent one, seen in 1781. This prediction inspired astronomer John Adams to begin calculations that led, in 1846, to Neptune being discovered. Ooh. And now we shall stargaze in the... No, okay. Moving on from astronomy, I want to talk briefly about geography, for this was Mary's third book, her most popular book in many ways. It was a 2-volume physical geography, which appeared in 1848. It looked at geography, geology, botany, astronomy, and zoology, drawing on the most recent discoveries in all of these fields to present an overview of their current understanding of the natural world and the Earth's place in the universe. This is the book that Mary mentioned in the letter when I first discovered her, that the Council of Education had adopted. It was incredibly successful, appearing on university textbook lists for many years. It went through 7 editions, many of them revised by Mary herself. And around this time, Murray began using Mary's likeness as a frontispiece in her books. In 1869, she received the Patrons Medal for the Royal Geographical Society for her works. The next thing I want to briefly look at is magnetism, and for this I want to go back to before she had even been approached by Henry Brougham to work on Laplace's translation. In the summer of 1825, Mary began a series of simple experiments to work out whether light rays possessed magnetising power. Through a prism very similar to this one, currently at Greenwich, she focused the rays of the sun on a long steel needle, half of which was covered in paper. Her conclusion was that magnetism was induced by the blue-green-violet end of the solar spectrum. If you want to see an example of this, I recommend you watch this film, Mr. Turner. It came out in 2014, and that is Mary Somerville herself, played by Leslie Manville, showing Turner how it worked. A report of her observations was published in 1826 in the Royal Society's Journal. Although, of course, being a woman, she couldn't go in to present the paper herself, her husband did instead. Her deductions were later proved to be incorrect, and she felt heartily ashamed for publishing her results. Indeed, she makes no reference to this whatsoever in her autobiography. This article is of great importance, not only for illustrating Mary's achievements, but also the relationship between the husband and wife. And Dr. Bridget Stenhouse has written a fantastic article looking at this couple, a powerhouse of a couple, and how William really supported his wife. Of course, Royal Society didn't allow women in, but a few years later they did write a letter to Mary stating they had commissioned a bust of her that would go in their grand hall to honour science, their country and themselves, and paying this proud tribute to the powers of the female mind. That's lovely. But we won't let the female mind in, of course. We need to keep some distance. But mathematics was the love of Mary's life, the thing that underpins so much. And it starts when she was a child. One day, at a very boring tea party around a friend's house, a friend was showing her a ladies' magazine, which included a mathematical problem involving lots of X's and Y's. This was her first introduction to algebra, and she was intrigued. She heard that Euclid would help with geometry and perspective and mathematical understandings, and she persuaded her brother's tutor to get her copies. But she wasn't allowed to stay up late with her candle reading. What a waste of a candle, letting a woman read. So as soon as she was put to bed, the candle was taken away from her. So what she used to do was memorize problems from the books, and then while she was lying there in her bed in the dark, try and work them out in her mind, and the next morning check if she had got them right. She did this and worked through all 6 volumes of Euclid's work, which I just think is phenomenal. And I mentioned earlier how the death of her first husband gave her freedom. This is illustrated by a recollection of hers from the first weeks of widowhood. I was chiefly occupied with my children, especially the one I was nursing, but as I did not go into society, I rose early and, having plenty of time, resumed my mathematical studies. I don't know if anyone here has had a small baby before, but I can't imagine studying anything, let alone mathematics, while looking after a small child. She started studying mathematics to such an extent that she was looking at the mathematical problems in the mathematical repository, submitting solutions, and in June 1811 she won the prize question, a problem which had required a good knowledge of higher algebra. The editor, William Wallace, was so impressed that he offered to provide mathematical instruction by correspondence, as did his brother John. And you could say that she had fallen in love with maths. This was a love that lasted her whole lifetime. In a letter to John Murray written in January 1872, when she was in her early 90s, she says, "It is curious that I am so much at home in mathematical subjects as ever I was, and as I have some excellent works, I spend 4 or 5 hours every morning in studying them." I can't do that in my 40s, let alone when I'm in my 90s. That's incredible. And I am very pleased that if you want to find out more about the mathematics, which has not been looked at so much for Mary Somerville, this year there was a fantastic PhD completed by Dr. Bridget Stenhouse on the mathematics, which I thoroughly recommend you look at. Moving on swiftly, for time is against me, I want to briefly talk about microscopes. This microscope is held by the History of Science Museum here in Oxford. That's my thumb there, in case you're interested. I was able to go and have a little look, but this is a microscope that Mary bought in Edinburgh when she visited it in 1844, ages 63, and she decided she wanted to investigate this new science and see what she could find through the microscope. So she bought herself essentially a starter kit for a microscope and was so inspired by it that in 1869, the last book published in her lifetime was On Molecular and Microscopic Science. And it was struck listening to the talk on Robert Hooke, how things had changed in just that period of time. Music is something I also want to briefly touch on. Although, of course, that is a skill she was taught as a female in order to get a husband, she was incredibly good at it. This is an unfinished study by Turner. And although it's provisionally titled Music Party East Cowes Castle, there are 3 possibilities of where and who the people are. The central figure is based on a pencil sketch made during Turner's stay in Paris in 1832, and it's believed that pencil sketch was of Mary Somerville, who was in Paris at the same time. And music was important to her life. In her book, Connection, Mary drew on the latest experiments of the day to write 2 chapters on sound, introducing this emerging field of acoustics to her readership. And it's interesting how the skills she learnt as a female then helped her as a scientist. But I know what you're all wanting to know. What about that orange marmalade? Well, orange marmalade, I'm afraid I have no evidence of her skill in this. But when coming up with the title for this talk, I wanted to highlight she did more than just mathematics and astronomy. She certainly knew how to make it, although I've no evidence of how good it was. She was fascinated in exploration, and she and her husband became friends with this man, William Edward Parry, who in 1824 was going to go sailing off to try and find the Northwest Passage. He invited them beforehand to come and view the ships he was preparing for his expedition. On this occasion, she recalls, I put in practice my lessons in cookery by making a large quantity of orange marmalade for the voyage. So there we go. Next time one of your friends is going off on a long voyage, make them some orange marmalade. Later, when he returned, she was informed that the name of Somerville had been given to an island so far to the north that it was all but perpetually covered with ice and snow. And that is Somerville Island, in a very, very small island in the Barrow Strait. Another skill I want to briefly mention was painting. She was taught as a child how to paint by Alexander Naismith, and she used this so much in her works. This is one of her paintings, which I absolutely love. It's held in the Fife Archives. But I want to finish by showing you this. This is a self-portrait. Self-portraits for me mean stick people. That's all I can do. This is a self-portrait. And I love it for it shows her sitting there with her book doing some works, although we're not entirely sure. But if you read her works, it's really interesting how you can see her experience and training as an artist really influences her descriptions. And I was struck by listening to the talk on Hook earlier that people who have been trained in art are then able to look at science in a different way. And I think that was part of the reason why Mary Somerville was so successful. Thank you.
Very much, Ruth, for a really fascinating, illuminating talk and showing us, just what a polymath Mary Somerville was, all the very different areas of life that she worked in, and for just keeping to time. Questions? I'm sure there's a question there in the middle.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. Excellent talk. I'm just astonished by this story about the Royal Society. And I'm like, okay, it was men, and I know we're not great, but I mean, do we have any record of her husband giving this talk? I mean, was he ironic in tone? Did he say, well, I'm terribly sorry she can't be here, chaps, but I'm going to tell you what she did? Or did they just treat it all perfectly straight? And
it was perfectly straight. It was perfectly natural. Of course, why would a woman present anything? There's debate. You sometimes see Mary referenced as being the first woman to publish in the Royal Society Journal. But Caroline Herschel had actually had some letters published a little bit earlier. So Caroline was the first to have letters, and then Mary was the first to have a paper. And actually the two of them knew each other through family connections. But it was just a natural thing. Women had not been allowed since not long after the Royal Society had been started. There's a wonderful story about a woman called Mad Madge, the Duchess of Newcastle, in the 17th century, who was very interested in science and wanted to go and see this new society, the Royal Society. And they hadn't thought women would be interested because they hadn't thought of women at all. So it didn't say in the Constitution women not allowed. So they had to let her in, and then they rewrote the Constitution as soon as she left.
Further questions? I'm sure we must have some further questions. Any more questions? Second on the front row there.
Out of sheer curiosity, what was the observation that made her to make that mistaken interpretation of, there must have been something. Was it a heat effect or something else that kind of produced some reading of some sort?
It was down to the equipment that she was using. And that's what the equipment at the time showed her. And it was as technology progressed, they were able to do the experiment in greater detail, that they then realised that things were not quite what she found. But it was literally that prism and a needle and covering it in half. It was very simple experiments she was doing with things you could find in your household. So it was correct with what she used. It was as technology progressed, as with anything in science, as technology progresses, results change, and that's what happened. But it really dented her confidence in many ways. And she talks in her autobiography about the shame she feels of not having any originality, of not having any genius. I would argue she was a genius, but for her, because that first kind of public experiment, I guess, was later found to be not right, it really changed the course of her career, definitely.
Question here in the front.
Thanks. That was lovely. A lovely delivery. Really, really enjoyed that. You cited some of the people that sort of helped her on her way, you know, all men, of course, who said, you know, Bruce and those other people. What would you say was her ongoing influence? I mean, can you sort of draw some lines, you know, especially seeing another woman, you know, it doesn't have to be about women, but I mean, if you happen to know any... Oh.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for realising that I hadn't actually finished the talk that I had prepared, for I had run out of time, and asking me a question that I can therefore carry on. During her lifetime, one of the biggest ways that she influenced was by tutoring Ada Lovelace. Now, Ada Lovelace had many mathematical tutors. I'm not claiming Mary Somerville was the only one, but it was through Mary Somerville that Ada Lovelace got to meet Charles Babbage, and that relationship then worked. Mary was Ada's chaperone during her stays in London before she got married. And actually it was Mary's oldest son who introduced Ada to the man who would become her husband. So as a family, she was hugely influential over Ada Lovelace, who then wrote the first computer program and that. And then in terms of legacy, there's Somerville College, 1879, so only a few years after she died. In fact, as I walked here this morning, I waved hello at it. When the suffragettes were having their parades, they often had banners commemorating brilliant women from the past, and this is an original suffragette banner. They were amazed at Mary Somerville, so they held her up. And then people weren't so interested in her for a while, but it's thanks to the Bodleian Library and Somerville College that people started to get interested again, that is where the bulk of her papers are held. And an amazing woman called Elizabeth Patterson went through and catalogued them and then wrote a book about Mary Somerville, and it kind of sparked a lot of interest. There is a moon crater in the eastern part of the moon, in case you're in that area, that is named after Mary Somerville. There is an asteroid belt that was discovered in 1987 named after her. She is now on the £10 Royal Bank of Scotland note up in Scotland, so I often spend a Mary. We can't afford a Mary. Can afford a Jane Austen. The Institute of Physics have a Mary Somerville medal that they award every now and then. These are just 3 fiction books that have been published in the last couple of years to mention or be inspired by Mary. And this is Mary Somerville herself here, singing in a musical that was performed during the Edinburgh Fringe. So there was a huge amount of interest not long after she died, and then it died down a little bit, but there's a huge amount of interest coming up now. And she does inspire. In fact, I mentioned Bridget. That is Bridget. She and I have become friends through our love of Mary Somerville. I was giving a talk on Mary 7 years ago at the Bodleian Library when Bridget was thinking about what to do for her PhD, and it helped to encourage her to think, yeah, do you know what, there's quite a lot about Mary I could do, definitely. But that portrait was commissioned by John Murray, the publisher. Most of the paintings that he had up in his house in Albemarle Street were all of the men. It's about the only one of the female. But if you were to look at it and have no idea who it was, there's no clue there as to what she did, which in itself I think is intriguing, how women are portrayed and how they're shown or not shown to be involved in various things. It's just a lovely portrait of a woman.
Thank you.
Do we have any further questions? One at the back. Oh no.
Can I ask a question?
There's one here.
What happened to her 2 surviving daughters? Did they end up living conventional lives, or did they follow in her footsteps?
Her daughters lived with her until she died. So she was 92 when Mary herself died. Her daughters then survived another 2-3 years and they died.
And did they have conventional careers or careers at all, or just married?
They don't seem to have done much at all. I think sometimes when you get a really incredible person, they can overshadow everything for everybody else. And it seems to have been a little bit like that. They got to know lots of people who were coming to see Mary Somerville in Italy, and they got to meet lots of people that way. They travelled a little bit as well, but they never got married. They never had a career of their own. They just seem to have followed their mum around. William Somerville had died about 12 years before Mary. So they'd also supported her mother through a lot of loss. Her oldest son, he survived through childhood, got married. He had an illegitimate child, but no legitimate children. And then he died while Mary was still alive. So she lost most of her children in her lifetime, apart from these 2 daughters who, and I don't know if there's nothing written down to say why they stayed with her. And part of me wonders if it's because Mary had lost so many people, whether she just wanted to keep them with her. or whether they just thought, you know what, we get to go to Italy if we stay with Mum. Absolutely.
Oh, yes. Yep. Sorry, your hand there.
I just wanted to ask you, after she died and Somerville College was founded, where my sister and mother both were graduates, did they benefit in any way from her, any financially in any way, or was it just the inspiration of her life that made them call it that?
I'm not aware of any financial reason. It certainly wasn't, as far as I'm aware, it wasn't a decision that came from the family. It was very much we're setting up a college for women. It's one of the first in Oxford. We want a name that will inspire women, and they felt at that time that Somerville would do it. So it seems to have been a decision made by those who set up the college. As far as I know, they didn't benefit financially, because there wasn't really any money around. But they do have a really lovely relationship with the family who still exist now. So there's no direct descendants, but via her brother there are descendants. And so Somerville College have got a lot of her paintings. They've got a collection of her shells in the original little drawers that she put them in and categorised them in, which I've been able to sneak in and look at. So they have that lovely, and Somerville College own the copyright to the papers that are in the Bodleian, all of her archives. So there's that kind of relationship, but I'm not aware of any financial one.
Thank you.
Another question here.
You mentioned John Adams and the prediction of Neptune. Of course, he's not credited with that because, as you know, he wasn't taken seriously. In fact, he went to meet the astronomer royal who was at dinner and didn't receive him for 3 hours, and he got fed up and left. And so Aubin Leverrier, the following year in France, is credited with the prediction. But didn't Mary Somerville herself get frustrated by the fact that she had communicated perhaps the biggest scientific sensation of the time, and that John Adams had failed to capitalize on it? And did she not talk to anybody else? I mean,
there's no surviving reference to that I've been able to find. I imagine she would have been very frustrated, absolutely. She was frustrated in terms of how women weren't taken seriously. She was very frustrated that women were given brains but not allowed to have the education to expand and use their brains. And I imagine she would have felt on John Adams's behalf really frustrated that he had done this work but wasn't being recognised. She would have absolutely have been on his side for that.
you mean as a family friend?
Not a family friend, but she was aware of him, absolutely. And yeah, she just... part of the trouble with the archive, and the archive is amazing, but Mary sorted it out herself before she died. So I suspect there's a lot that she didn't allow to be kept. It's like her autobiography, which was published posthumously. Her daughter also took out some bits from there, because by that point you're very Victorian and you have to be very polite and don't say certain things. So for example, one of the bits that her daughter took out was Mary had talked about how I think it was one of her uncles who taught her how to swear when she was a child, and her daughter was like, I'm not having my mother swearing, I'm taking that out of the book. So I suspect if there had been any kind of reference that Mary had made to any frustration or anything like that, it would have been destroyed before we got to know it. But the Mary that I have created in my mind, she was very frustrated, definitely.
Thank you.
I think the gentleman with the microphone had a question.
I did have a question. So you mentioned earlier that she translated Laplace's work, but you mentioned that it wasn't quite just a translation, it was more of a rendering. And I was curious if you could say a little bit more about what that involved, and was this a task that she kind of like took upon herself, or was this assigned when they asked her to translate his work?
This is partly where I don't know enough about the science to be able to give you a full answer, but my understanding is that Laplace had no diagrams in it, no tables, nothing like that. So all of that she put in, if I quickly scoot back to that one, all of that she's put in, she's had to come up with that herself. And she's done that for an English audience because the French scientists looked at things very differently. And so they didn't rely so much, my understanding anyway, is that they didn't rely so much on the diagrams and the tables that she inserted. So she had to work out how to represent what was being talked about in a diagram, which is much more than, I think when we talk about translation, we kind of think of it as a modern kind of this word equals that word in different languages. There was a bit of that, obviously, from the French to the English, but my understanding of Laplace is that he wasn't always that clear in French anyway. And so she had to kind of translate it into English and then translate that into something that was understandable in English. So there was a lot of work that she had to do around that. I'm not sure if Broome would have realised how much work was involved. He knew there would have been some work, but I'm not sure if anyone had realised at that point just how much work that would have been involved in that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, from what you've said, that, you know, Broome was organising the SD UK publication. So, I mean, her original commission had been to kind of make Laplace accessible as opposed to a strict translation. So I think, you know, and then, but given how hard it was to begin with, I think, you know, that's right. Right, I think we're just spot on time now. So I think let's thank Ruth again for a fantastic talk. And,